Good morning. This is Brenda Combs and Denny Paul May coming to you live from the Holler Studios at KVEC. And today we're going to be talking about some additional topics from the IEP guidance document, continuing our series on that document and just trying to get some information out to you folks that is regarding the IEP guidance document. One of the things that we notice, and you may notice if you attend some of our trainings, is we talk in acronyms a lot, where we kind of shorten things up, and we look at things like FAPE and LRE and IEP and RDA and all those kinds of things. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about two different ones today. We're actually splitting this up into two videos. The first one is going to be on least restrictive environment. And so lots of times you'll hear us refer to the LRE. What is the LRE? And then in the second video in today's series, we're going to talk to you about FAPE, a free appropriate public education. So without further ado, we'll talk about least restrictive environment now, and I'm just going to kind of go back to the regulation and kind of let you know exactly what least restrictive environment means. And it says straight from the regulation, it means that to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities are educated with students who are not disabled. And you know, this includes special classes, separate schools, or removal from the general education environment. That can only occur if in the general education environment, with the use of supplementary aids and services, that these services cannot be satisfactorily achieved due to the nature and severity of the disability. So in layman's terms, we're just talking about do we have the placement correct based on the needs of the IEP, and are we in fact placing our children, students with disabilities, in locations to receive these services that are in fact the least restrictive environment, and are having them in environments where they are with their peers to the maximum extent appropriate.
All right, so when we're looking at that and we're looking at it in basic terms, what we're saying is the least restrictive environment, it refers to the setting where the child with a disability can receive an appropriate public education designed to meet his or her needs alongside with peers that are non-disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. And they're based on decisions about student performance data and the following IEP services. So when we're looking at things, we're looking at the student specially designed instruction. And we have already done a series on specially designed instruction, but that plays a big role as well when looking and considering the least restrictive environment. Supplementary aids and services is the next item, and we've also talked about that, and we're hoping to see our new IEP handbook come out with the new specially designed instruction and supplementary aids and services listed. Related services, and then program modifications and supports for school personnel. And when we're talking about those pieces, we're talking about program modifications for the child. They could be on a half-day school or whatever. That's where that would go, because we're doing some modifications with that child's program, and that would affect the least restrictive environment. And the ARC, they discuss the locations and the placement of the IEP at the same time. And the document decisions are in 4 different places in that IEP. So the first one, when you look at it, is talking about in the actual LRE section. And the ARC, they explain to the extent in which the child is not going to participate in a content area. When Denny, Paul, and I do regular reviews, in that little box, we're not finding the content area. Remember, we have to have the content area. If they're going to participate in the general education curriculum, but have co-teaching in math and reading, then you need to state math and reading, even though they're going to be in a co-teaching setting. So we still need to know that, because it has to align with the other special education services. And then on your IEP special education services and the related services, if the child has the related services, that also describes the location to where the child is going to have those services. Is it going to be a resource room? Is it going to be the co-teaching room? Is it going to be in a separate class? Those types of things, and that's where we have to document that. Then on the conference summary, it has a piece in there that talks about the placement. And there's 3 different places in there, and it talks about, can the child handle the regular education classroom? You have to accept it or you have to reject it. And then the next one goes down to part-time special ed, part-time general ed. And then, of course, the last one would be your separate classroom. So you have to go through that continuum, and there's a larger continuum than that, but that is what is written in that section, because we do know we have children that are on homebound services and are receiving services in other places. So that's one thing that we have to consider. And then on your conference summary, you have a part that says consideration of potential harmful effects. That also relates back to your special education LRE. If the child does have some issues that it will affect the child in that LRE, we have to explain that, and then we have to give documentation as to how that child is going to receive services. So we have to make sure that we document that.
Okay, so when we're talking about this and we're looking at the record reviews and we're hearing the input from the State Department when we're working with CAPS, we know that we have to check to see that those 4 areas match up, that we don't conflict with anything. So therefore, if we say we're pulling out for a certain amount of time, then that's reflected on the services page. It's so very, very important to understand that and there are some really good examples on page 59 of the IEP guidance document. You can look to see how that LRE statement is supposed to be documented, and how it's very clear that you say exactly, you're transparent with what you're doing. You say, we're pulling them out for this much time into the resource room. We're having them in regular ed for these classes, and we're very transparent. And then we go to the services page, and we make sure that we, in fact, are doing the exact same thing that we said we were doing in that box before. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out, too, is when you go to the placement options, and you're looking at rejecting or accepting those placement options, one of the things that Brenda and I look at, and we see this missing lots of times in our record reviews as we go through these districts in our region, we see that sometimes we fail to list the reasons. Even with the use of supplementary aids and services, we fail to list the reasons as to why that student would need a particular pullout into a more restricted environment. So it's very important that you come up with those reasons, that you list some things like repetition of skills and immediate feedback,
slower pace of service,
environments that are more conducive to their learning. So what we're trying to say here is, as we restrict the environment, there has to be some reasons for that. We have to be able to make sure that we document that. And then when we do take that into consideration, then that 4th place is, are we doing any type of harmful effect to the student by restricting their environment? And we need to discuss that. So when we discuss that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the program. When we discuss that, we need to make sure that we are not for failing to mention that and what we can possibly do to kind of offset that. So if you're talking about, back to our subject here, least restrictive environment, LRE, using those acronyms, we know that the least restrictive environment, we always have to determine it annually. So it's part of the IEP process. It's part of understanding that the child, yes, is eligible. Yes, the child needs special design instruction. Yes, the child still is a student with a disability, and they need special design instruction, and there is an adverse effect on their educational performance based on that disability. And then based on the student's IEP, we know that the least restrictive environment should be delivered as near to the student's home as possible, and that it be an age-appropriate placement. That we know in the regulations that we have some stipulations as to what students can, age-wise, can be educated with other students. So for example, we can't have a large gap having elementary students being placed with high school students for their educational services. So we have to be careful with that. And then we do, in fact, have to consider those harmful effects. And so Brenda's going to talk to you about that just a little bit here with the LRE considerations.
All right, so some things that we need to consider when determining that least restrictive environment is potential harmful effects, just like Denny Paul has been talking about. I think sometimes we go in there and we just check that box, and we don't really think about that until something really happens and then we're called back to the table due to a child has some kind of a behavior issue or something. So we need to consider that, especially with our EBD students and those that have more severe behaviors. Not removing a student from general education solely because of needed modifications and in the general curriculum. We don't want to pull them out a lot because, number one, special education teachers, we give the specially designed instruction that the student needs so that they can get their work done, or we help them chunk down things or scaffold things so they can learn it better. So that is our job. But then your general education teacher, they are the content specialist. That is where the students, all students, even your disabled students, have to be in there and have to receive that instruction. If not, they're not going to understand what it is that they have to do. So we try not to pull them out for instruction. That is a no-no. We just don't pull them out for that. If we have to pull them out for something, we will pull them out after the instruction is given. Then providing or arranging for provisional of non-academic and extracurricular services and activities for a student with disability. And many of us have seen on TV and we have or even heard about the deaf student that played football. Well, the deaf student that played football on the sideline had an interpreter. So when we're looking at things, there are things that we have to consider and things that a child must have in order to get through those extracurricular activities or those non-academic pieces. It's not all about academics. It's about the whole child. While they're in that school, we have to make sure that they are receiving the least restrictive environment for everything.
So, one of the things too that the IEP guidance document points out is that when the setting documented on the IEP is a hospital or institution, the ARC must consider the continuum of placement options within that setting that meets the needs of the students with disabilities. Therefore, the ARC must make individualized placement decisions. Okay, the ARC may not routinely place students with disabilities within these correctional facilities in classes that include only students with disabilities. They must have a regular education option and some co-teaching options. So those continuing of placement options must also apply to those home hospital and those institutionalized settings. So we as an ARC team, we should not forget that as we think about, is the child going on homebound, or is the child going to a hospital setting, or is it going to a DJJ facility, maybe like some of the facilities that we see, across the state. And so we certainly need to keep that in mind as we move forward, that we can't just place those children there and expect just to give special education services. We also have to provide the regular ed services that go along with that. So when we are talking about least restrictive environment for a student who receives most core content classes in general education, the LER should be described in these ways. Sarah will not participate in general education for language arts. She will receive language arts instruction in the resource room. Or you can do special education, semicolon, language arts, and then you come down here and write out general education, semicolon, and do math, social studies, science, and related arts. So there, on that, like I said, on page 59 of your IEP guidance document, there's many different scenarios that are laid out for you, so you can refer to that as you move forward in considering LRE and what LRE is. Just keep in mind that there's 4 places where we document it, and there's 2 places on the IEP, and there's 2 places on the conference summary where we have to make sure that those things match up and there's transparency with what we're doing as we provide services for students with disabilities. Thank you.